You've probably heard of economist Jeffrey Sachs. He's got this viral, and let's be honest, super controversial take on the war in Ukraine. He's basically saying that for the last 30 years, US foreign policy has been laser-focused on one single goal, and that this goal is what made the war in Ukraine pretty much inevitable. So what is this big project? And why is Sachs so insistent that this isn't just some theory he cooked up, but something he saw with his own two eyes as an advisor to world leaders? All right, let's get into it and break this all down.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dig into his core idea, this so-called unipolar project. Then we'll look at the big piece of evidence he uses, the whole story of NATO expansion. After that, we'll connect the dots to how he sees the origins of the war in Ukraine. And finally, we'll touch on his take on the new political reality we're in now.
Okay, before we dive deep, you've really got to understand where Sachs is coming from with all this. He makes it super clear. This isn't some academic theory for him. He says he was there, in the rooms advising leaders from Gorbachev and Russia all the way to governments in Poland and Ukraine. So his whole point is that what he's saying isn't something he read in a book, it's what he concluded from literally decades of first-hand experience with the main players.
All right, let's jump right into the core of his argument. Section 1 is all about this unipolar project thesis. According to Sachs, pretty much everything that's happened in U.S. foreign policy flows from this one really powerful idea that took hold in Washington right as the Cold War was wrapping up.
And that big idea? He calls it unipolarity. So what does he mean by that? Well, as Sachs describes it, it's this mindset that just completely took over Washington after the Soviet Union fell apart. The thinking was pretty simple, and he claims totally absolute. The USSR is gone, so now the US is the only superpower left. We're the ones who run the world now. And that meant we didn't have to pay attention to any other country's security worries, their red lines, none of it mattered anymore. Now, Sachs argues this wasn't just some vague feeling in the air. Oh no. He says it turned into a very specific playbook. The core tenets were basically this. The US runs the show. Period. The United Nations framework? Yeah, that's optional. And the very idea of a country being neutral? Sachs says that became a dirty word in D.C. The logic, as he lays it out, was just black and white. If you don't have a U.S. military base on your soil, you're not with us, and you might be against us. A really stark way of looking at the world.
Okay, so if this whole unipolar project thing is real, where's the evidence, right? Well, for Jeffrey Sachs, there's a clear Exhibit A, the story of NATO's relentless expansion eastward over the last 3 decades. This is the absolute centerpiece of his case.
And that story, according to Sachs, begins right here. It all hinges on what he calls a rock-solid promise made to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev back in 1991. The deal, as he tells it, was basically this. Let a unified Germany join NATO, and we promise you the alliance will not move 1 inch to the east. Now, this supposed promise, it's absolutely crucial to everything else he argues.
But, as you can probably guess, Sachs says that promise was broken. And not just broken, but methodically dismantled. Just look at this timeline. By 1994, President Clinton makes NATO enlargement official U.S. policy. Fast forward to 99, and you see Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic join. Then boom, 2004 brings this massive expansion with 7 more countries, including the Baltic states, bringing NATO right up to Russia's doorstep. In Sachs's view, none of this was accidental. And then you get to 2008, which he sees as the most inflammatory move of all, the U.S. making a formal push for Ukraine and Georgia to join too.
And the timing here is just critical to his argument. Because only 1 year before that big push for Ukraine and Georgia, Vladimir Putin gave this now famous speech at the Munich Security Conference. He basically drew a line in the sand saying, "Stop, enough now." And what was the U.S. response, according to Sachs? It wasn't just to ignore the warning, it was to double down and do the exact thing he warned against.
Okay, so that's the 30-year backstory. But how does Sachs connect all of that directly to the invasion we saw in 2022? Well, he points to a very specific chain of events that he considers the final, direct triggers for the war.
He lays out 4 key moments. First, in 2010, Ukraine elects a president, Yanukovych, whose whole platform was based on neutrality, on keeping Ukraine out of NATO. But then in 2014, that same president is overthrown in the Maidan Revolution, which Sachs flat-out calls a US-backed regime change operation. This sparks the war in the Donbass, which leads to a peace deal called Minsk II. But, and this is a huge but for Sachs, that deal is never actually enforced, so the conflict just simmers. And then the final straw, in his telling, comes in late 2021. Russia puts an actual treaty on the table, and its main demand is simple, a guarantee that NATO will not expand to include Ukraine. The US response? A refusal to even negotiate on that core point. So really, this all boils down to a fundamental disagreement about motive. Why did Russia invade? The narrative you hear most often, the one Sachs calls childish propaganda, is that Putin is trying to reconstruct some kind of old Russian empire. But Sachs has a totally different take. He argues the goal was much more specific, and in a way more pragmatic, to brutally force Ukraine to the negotiating table and get a permanent deal on neutrality to keep NATO off its border once and for all.
And that brings us to maybe the most explosive claim Sachs makes. He alleges that in March and April of 2022, just weeks after the invasion started, a peace deal was this close to being signed. So what happened? Why did it fall apart? Well, according to Sachs, Ukraine backed out of the deal. He claims they did so after the US and the UK advised them against it, arguing that the stakes were much higher than just Ukraine, that Western hegemony itself was on the line.
Okay, so that's his version of the past. But what does he think about the future? In this last section, let's look at Sachs's analysis of where this all ends up, for the US, for Europe, and for the war itself.
So after all this, the big question is, what happens next? In Sachs's view, this 30-year project didn't just fail, it culminated in a total catastrophe. So let's look at his predictions for where we go from here.
He lays out a few really stark predictions. First, on Trump and the war. He thinks the war will probably end if Trump wins, but for a very cynical reason, because Trump, in his words, doesn't want to carry a loser. Then he turns to Europe, and he's incredibly critical. He basically says Europe has no independent foreign policy of its own and that it just acts like a subsidiary to the United States. His final overarching point? The entire unipolar project has been a massive failure. He believes the US pushed and pushed, expecting Russia to just roll over, and it backfired spectacularly.
And to wrap it all up, to really drive his point home as a final warning, especially to America's allies, Sachs brings up this really famous and frankly chilling quote from Henry Kissinger: "To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal." And that's really the provocative note he ends on. It leaves you with a huge question. Was the last 30 years a story of building security and alliances, or was it, as Sachs argues, a massive unipolar gamble that ended with truly fatal consequences?